With me today is a friend of mine, and I'm happy to call him a friend. He's not only just a great human, but he is extremely interested in our country and our state. And he has a new organization that we're going to talk about, and talk about some things that he's working with and some things going on in the Louisiana legislature that you might have been hearing about, some updates. With me today is Christopher Alexander. Christopher, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Sir William Wallis, it's a privilege to be with you.
Thank you very much. The honor's all mine. I'm excited we're getting to do this today, and I'm glad you carved out some time. And we're gonna kind of go back and forth. I want you to tell me about your organization, but Monday was veto day, I think, or was it today was veto day, and now we're getting some answers on whether there's going to be a veto session or not, right?
Yes, and William, I have to tell you, I'm looking through some of these Republicans who said that there's no need for a veto session, and I'm saying, what in the world are you doing here? What do you mean there's no need for a veto session? So I call some of these folks up and I ask them, why did you suggest you're a Republican and you represent to your constituencies that you're conservative Republicans? Why would you suggest there's no need for a veto session? And well, they said, well, Chris, we didn't realize that we didn't think we would have the votes. We wouldn't have the votes, so what's the point of calling the session? Well, my response to that is, you are Republican conservatives. You're constitutionalists. At least that's what you represent to your constituents. You go in there and fight. You go in there and demand that these vetoes be overrun. You don't just cave in and throw in the towel just because you don't know if you're going to have the votes. That's not what patriots do.
And you're not going to know if you have the votes unless you're not going to know if you have the votes unless you go in there and try to have the vote counted.
And have the vote count. And guess what? You get in there, William, and guess what it does? If you go in there and you come up 2 votes short because a couple of Republicans decided they didn't want to show up, guess what? You're doing a service to the citizens of Louisiana.
Absolutely.
Because you're exposing the Republicans who didn't show up and who caused it to fail. By not going in there and doing your due diligence and following through to the end, you're protecting weak Republicans who don't want to be there and who are not going to show up.
And this is all about the checks and balances. I mean, if you think about it, I'll cover it a couple of different ways. First off, not only Republicans, but Democrats should want a veto session, unless, of course, they're playing the game of strategy, which is they're trying to protect the governor's veto, which, is the case in this point, actually, while they're not having one. But even Democrats should still want a veto session because maybe they want to protect some of their votes or stand by their votes or double down on their votes, if you will, to show their constituency, even though we might not agree with them, that, hey, they believe in a checks and balance system where nobody, not even Democrats nor Republicans, go unchecked. And that's the way it should be.
That's the way it should be. And you're so right, William. It's all part of the fundamental constitutional process that we have in place. If you go back in and some of these bills are, in fact, overturned, well, guess what? That is reflective of the will of the people. There's no body that is closer to the heart and the will of a majority of Louisianans than our elected representatives in the state house. So you go back in a veto override session, and guess what? If you override a few vetoes, that is most closely reflects the will of a majority of Louisianans. At least in theory, that is how our system works. But when you have weak Republicans who are sending in opt-out forms saying there's no need for a veto override session because we don't know if we're going to have the votes, that is nothing but a cop-out. That is a textbook example of the kind of weakness that we have in our elected officials, particularly these weak Republicans, that we've got to do something about, William. We've got to get these weak Republicans out of office. And that is part of the reason that is the central focus of LACAG, Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, is to expose by name.
And that's the name of your organization, right?
Yes, that's my organization, LACAG.org, LACAG.org. And we are meticulously exposing the actions that these Republicans take on these critical items of legislation that kill kill these bills in committee. And guess what, William? Their actions don't show up on conservative rating voter scorecards. You know why? Because they never made it to the full chamber, and therefore they don't show up on the cards, and they know that. It's like someone going into your house with gloves on, stealing all your stuff, messing with your house, but they have gloves on so you can't find their DNA, and then they slither away into the night, and you can never detect what they've done. And they go back to their constituents and talk about what faithful conservatives they are. We can't have that anymore.
And
we
you know what?
Have that anymore.
I'm gonna say it this way too, and I agree with you 100%. I always say though that conservatism knows no party. We always like to tie in the word with Republicans being, or the good Republicans being conservative, but conservatism knows no party line. I think there are some Democrats, as you know, that are more conservative than some of the Republicans that we know. And I say, what's that?
That's a great point.
Yeah, and I say it that way because, when you talk about faith, family, fiscal conservatism, you talk about, school choices and school and education. Those are all conservative values that, we want to say are make us good or better Republicans. And I don't want to scare away some Democrats that could align themselves with conservative values. But at the same time, to your point now, that even though that's the case where conservatism knows no boundary, there's a lot of Republicans that try to label themselves as being conservatives to make it like they're better Republicans, when in fact, if they're not showing up for a veto session, they shouldn't even be allowed to use that term no more than a Democrat who doesn't vote in a conservative way.
William, I couldn't have said it better. And the central criticism that our group has of these Rhino Republicans is that they should be persuading, they should be educating, they should be reaching out to these Democrats, not to compromise our principles with them, but to help them to understand how conservatism and constitutional conservatism really is the foundation of the country.
And if we show them that, we could gather more support. I'm interrupting you because we have to take a break. But when we get back from the break, Christopher, we're going to talk about what your organization does, how you started, why you started it. But I'm also going to do a teaser coming up. We're going to have to name some of these people that didn't want to veto override, Democrats and Republicans, because I think it should be part of the system to do an automatic override, don't you?
We've got the name, Sir William.
All right, after the break, we're going to be back here with you, Christopher Alexander, talking about your organization. Everybody else, stay tuned. Welcome back here to William Wallis for America with Christopher Alexander. Christopher, let's talk about your organization, what the name of it is again, how it started, and what your mission is with it.
William, I just spent 2 years down at the legislature during the session, me and my wife, Katie, whom you've met, and a number of other people would go down. And that was the first direct exposure, William, that I had to how things actually work in the legislature. And I noticed that every powerful special interest group in the state has lobbyists down there who lobby for them to make sure they get what they want, make sure they grease the right palms, and make sure they walk out of there with what they want. And I'm sitting in there one day, and I'm watching how these legislators enrich themselves, and I asked myself, is there any lobbyist or advocate who represents the ordinary Louisiana citizen here, who just gets up every day and goes to work, busts his rear end to support and protect his family, maybe has a little money left over at the end of the week, can go see a movie, go to dinner, maybe go drink a beer somewhere, but just wants to be left alone by their government and not oppressed anymore by their own government? Who represents those people? And I couldn't find anybody down there. And I said, well, somebody has to do it. So we're going to do it. And that's why we founded Louisiana Citizens Advocacy Group. And that's why it's named that, Citizen Advocacy. We are going to represent the average ordinary Louisianan, and we're going to hold these people accountable who defy their obvious wishes, from vaccine mandates to keeping dirty money out of politics to opposing these monstrous windmill bills where green energy companies are going to get massive federal subsidies for an energy project that does not work. and all of the other things across the board, from critical race theory being taught in our schools. 2 Republican legislators this year, William, killed a bill that would have allowed parents to see the actual lessons that their public school teachers are teaching their children. And the reason why we needed the bill was because of this critical race theory, this poisonous doctrine that teaches that our Constitution and our founding documents are intrinsically racist, and that's creeping into our schools, William, and you know that.
Yeah, I just did a podcast last week. It was my 4th of July podcast, where I'm doing a thing on the Founding Fathers, and I dive pretty deep in this, and I'm going to give a spoiler on it just to kind of pique the interest of some people, but to make your point also. Our Founding Fathers, when they were born in America, slavery had already been in existence for 150 years. And when our Founding Fathers, when they were raised, they actually wanted to find ways to abolish slavery. But because it was so entrenched in our society for 150 years, they couldn't just end it. But what they did, when you study not only what they said, but what they did, you see that our Founding Fathers laid up, they started the path. They started the trailhead that would lead everybody to freedom and liberty and eventually be able to end slavery. And people are never going to learn that if they're being taught that they're racist or that our country's racist. So it makes your point that, if we taught more history, actual history, than narratives, our country, our people, our citizens, our children would be a lot better off.
Oh, William, that is exactly right. And our Founding Fathers were intellectual and moral revolutionaries. Never in the history of human society had any group come forward and put forth as a fundamental proposition that the individual is sovereign, and the power resides in the individual, and the individual voluntarily delegates his power to a government as long as that government is protecting his right of individual sovereignty. And our Founding Fathers were intellectual revolutionaries in putting that doctrine forward. So you're so right. Yes. Was it perfect? No. Was slavery in existence in our country? Absolutely yes. But if our Founding Fathers had insisted at that time in not having provided for slavery legally, we wouldn't have had a constitution. It would have crushed the founding principles of this country. So you're right. What they did was they put the framework in place whereby ultimately we had a Martin Luther King who could rest his movement on the principles contained in the Declaration of Independence, and a Selma and a civil rights movement. Without the Constitution of the United States and the core ideals it contains, there is no Selma. There is no civil rights movement. There is no ultimate liberation for African Americans. So as ugly as a stain as that is on our history, but for the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, African Americans are not free in this country now, and thank God they are.
Yeah, people don't realize that our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence came 150 years after slavery was already here. So it was the best way to segue us out of it and lay that path. And I'm glad the way you said it also. Well, so if kind of going back to your organization here for a second. So basically what I like about the fact that you're going to represent the average person. If somebody in, let's say, somewhere in Louisiana says, I feel that I'm going to use this word or say it this way just to make the point. Let's say somebody feels an injustice on their rights or their property or the school or whatever the case may be, and they feel like their voice is not being heard because they're just the average guy. They're lucky to go buy a beer once a week at a bar, or they're just paying the bills. Are they the people that can come to you and say, hey, Christopher, can your organization, lobby for me, put something together, help me out, put me in touch with the right people and represent me?
Absolutely. And the first thing that I would do when that gentleman called me, I would want to see if his grievance was grounded in any kind of legislation that was allowed to go through our legislature in violation of the Constitution, because so many of these issues that we have are the direct result of actions that violate core principles of individual sovereignty contained in our Constitution, directly or indirectly. So if someone calls me up and says, here's my grievance, here's what's going on with me, I would first look and see, is his grievance rooted in bad legislation? If it is, then we're going to go and attack that legislation, and we're going to try to get it changed. And if his grievance is rooted, for instance, I mean, William, do you realize that there is nothing in this state right now that we can do? Every single transaction in this state is taxed. We're
Right.
taxed on every single thing we do. How is that possible in a legislature that has got a supermajority in one house and a majority in the other? How are we taxed to death in this state when our legislature is constructed that way? And
So-
that's a genuine question. I'd like to hear your answer.
Yeah, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna have a different opinion on it. I agree with you about the legislature now, but those taxes got there from years and years and years of when the Democrats were in control and when the Republicans were a minority. Now, I'm not taking blame away from the Republicans, and I'm not trying to necessarily put it on the Democrats, but those taxes got there over the last generations and generations of legislators that put that on us. But to your point again, we have a majority of Republicans in there now. It should be our time to say, no, we're going to not only have veto sessions, but we're going to take some control here, and we're going to get rid of some of these taxes and show people what financial freedom is. We're going to unravel some of the legislation that's burdening our public and show them what freedom is, so future legislative bodies become more Republican, more freedom-oriented, and less tax-oriented, so we can unwind and unravel this mess over the next couple generations of legislators. Now, I'm gonna pause, but we got 22 seconds, and we have to take another commercial break, and this is our long one. So I want you to answer all this after we get back. But
Sure.
Again, to your point, we got control now, and I don't mean that we need to take it and force them to do something that's bad, but force them to do something that's good for our society. Christopher, we'll talk about this after the break here on WGSO. All right, everybody, welcome back to William Wallis for America, my show here on WGSO 990 AM, but can also be found on all podcast apps, iHeart, iTunes, Stitcher, Apple, you name it, I'm on it. Catch me on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble. So I'm always on there. But like I said, I got some really good stuff coming up, some good content coming up, which you'll be surprised at when you see it. But with me today is Christopher Alexander here. Christopher, so talk to me a little bit more about your organization, a little bit more people can get a hold of you. And then also we're going to flip this around and talk about the ones who did call for a veto, because I want to shine the light on the people that called for a veto override, because they're the good guys.
Absolutely, and it's so important to. I mean, you're going to call out the people who are weak and who are not honoring their duties. It's important to call out the ones who are. I couldn't agree with you more. But LACAG, Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, William, again, it's a political advocacy organization that is designed to expose legislators. And you know what? Based on what you told me a little while ago, it's not just any legislator who is not honoring basic constitutional principles, whether it's for bodily autonomy, whether it is legislation that would protect the integrity of our vote. I'll tell you one, William, and this is one that I couldn't believe it. I really couldn't believe it. I know that you are intimately familiar with the massive injection of money that Mark Zuckerberg made into the critical swing states in 2020, basically buying off the election officials there and I think swung those precincts in Biden's favor, and I think that probably was the difference in the election. $400 million that he injected directly into the coffers of those election officials, and if anybody thinks that didn't make a huge difference, then well, they're delusional. So in response to that,
just look at the states that won Biden over are the same states where Zuckerberg put all of his money.
Exactly. So Blake Miguez, a great Republican representative here in Louisiana, put forward House Bill 811, and it was very straightforward. Every conservative in Louisiana, every honest person in Louisiana should have voted for it, much less all the Republicans in the legislature. And all it did was say, no private money gets to be injected into the coffers of public election officials who are responsible for conducting elections, whether it's commissioners of election, clerks of court, registrars of voters. No dark money. It is strictly prohibited, period. This bill would have kept the elections clean, and it came in direct response to the absolute fiasco of Zuckerberg in 2020. Well, it passes out of the House, passes out of the Senate committee, and then goes on to the Senate floor. And our esteemed leader, which my good friend Moon Griffon calls Blank Page Cortez, he is the Republican leader of our House, the guy who is supposed to be bringing the conservatives together and making sure that good legislation gets passed. He deliberately pushed that bill beyond the point where it required only a simple majority in the Senate, and he pushed it to a point where it required a 2/3 majority because he didn't want to hear it. And finally, when he heard it, it required a 2/3 majority, and it still almost passed. It needed 26 votes to pass, and it got 25. And Page Cortez made sure that when he called that bill up, 2 Republican senators were not in the chamber. One had left to go on vacation, which he shouldn't have done, but he wasn't there. And that was Hensgens, Representative Hensgens, and then Rick Ward, I think a rhino Republican in the Senate, was not in the chambers. And so it fell 2 votes short. Page Cortez orchestrated the murder of a bill that would have kept dark money out of our political process here in Louisiana. And you know what he wants to do now, William?
What's that?
He now wants to run for lieutenant governor. Did you know that?
Everybody's running for lieutenant governor this next time around. Do you know that?
Yeah.
But
so Page Cortez, he's going to be the Republican. He's going to be the Republican champion running for lieutenant governor, going around the state talking about what a conservative he is. He killed the most important election integrity bill in the entire session.
And what's killing me right now is to think that these guys know what they're doing. And if they're, and let's just put conservatism aside and just look at the fact that we should not allow money, out of state money, come into our private elections. And for the Democrats who say that, now that we have a Democrat governor who might believe in it, we shouldn't allow it for one big reason, that guess what, guys? When the tide turns, you're not going to want that money used against your elections. And it can be used against the Democrats just as much as it can be used against the Republicans. And nobody sees the fact that instead of looking at the facts, they look at the narratives. So what I think is it's the narratives that they use to divide us. And to another point you made earlier about lobbyists, we like to think, the easier way to say is that it's money being passed on to convince people of their votes. But oftentimes, it's just as simple as a narrative. Hey, this is what's going to happen if you don't do this, or this is what, they create a narrative to manipulate people's minds to step away from freedom, to step away from liberty. They're these really smart people who have nefarious plans, use these narratives to get somebody to step away from their principles, from what's right, from their freedoms, from their liberties, from fiscal responsibility, to be able to follow a narrative down a path that's going to either get them reelected or on to something else.
Yes, indeed, William. And as you were speaking, what you just said prompted me to think about something out of the Nuremberg trials, and I think that this will make some sense to you when you talk about people stepping away from their principles when it benefits them while being blind to the fact that the precedent they're setting could end up coming back and hurting them. The Nuremberg trials, it's all over, the war is over, and they're trying all of these horrible Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. And Robert Jackson, who was an associate U.S. Supreme Court justice, was the chief prosecutor there. And the Russians wanted to summarily execute these German generals. The Brits wanted to summarily execute them. All of our allies wanted to simply take them out into a field and kill them. And Robert Jackson, the great U.S. Supreme Court justice, said, we cannot do that, because if we do that, if we deprive even people that we know and believe are guilty, if we deprive them of core due process and a fair trial, we are building a poison chalice that could ultimately reach to our lips. And that is why it is so important that we honor our principles, even when deviation from those principles might benefit us in the short term.
Right.
And I think that's the point that you were making.
Absolutely. You said it a little bit more eloquently with a little bit of history to back it up, which I absolutely love. Great job. I appreciate it. That's why I was so excited about having you on my show, because when I get to talk to you on a private level, I see how you think, I hear how you think, and I love the planning ahead. But most of all, when I hear you on private conversations, and what I'm hoping people hear now is, freedom and liberty, fiscal responsibility, and the rights of people, they scream from your soul. In such a way that you don't want it just for you. You don't want freedom and liberty and the rights for people just for people that agree with you. You want it for everybody. And that's the beauty of what we're talking about, Christopher, is that when you really scream for freedom, liberty for everybody, and you put the narratives aside, and you put ideology aside, you put party aside, and you just do what's right, everybody wins on an equal playing field, and nobody gets ahead. And better yet, you don't create a path that's going to be where only some people succeed in the future. You create a path where everybody can succeed in the future, and everybody wins, and everybody gets the freedom and liberty that us as humans deserve here on Earth.
Well said, William. Let me use one example. William, would you stand, and this is a question for you, would you stand just as fervently for a person's right, individual right, to get a vaccine, let's say the COVID vaccine, if they chose? Would you stand just as fervently for their right to do that as you would for a person to decline getting a vaccine if they chose to?
I'm going to answer that question after this next break, because we got to take a break. That was a perfect timing. It's almost like we did it on purpose, but we have a commercial break. I'm going to answer that, and that's an excellent question, because you're making me want to say, think about something else to say. It's a great layup. So we're going to talk about that after the break here, Christopher, here in WGSO 990 AM with my show, William Wallis for America, after the break. All right, everybody, welcome back to William Wallis for America, WGSO 990 AM. And also my podcast at William Wallis for America. And with me today is Christopher Alexander. Christopher, you asked me a question right before we left, and I'll repeat it for you as I got it, which is, would I stand for somebody's freedom to get a vaccine as much as I would that didn't want a vaccine? Is that correct?
That's the question.
The answer is yes. I'm glad you say this, because I'm gonna parallel that with something else that I always talk about too, is that, freedom's a burden. Freedom is a huge burden, because when you believe in freedom, you very often have to believe in freedoms that you don't like or don't appreciate. And sometimes that can be a fine line, and I'm just going to use abortion because it's the most active one right now to talk about. which is a freedom that I don't agree with. And I know God in the Bible has "thou shalt not kill," and a lot of the people that are on the pro-life side say, well, that's the reason for, that's really not a freedom. But I always say it's a freedom that I don't agree with, and I tend to fight that with another way of saying that. And I'm using this extreme because I'm going to get you back to your point here in a second. And I'm using that extreme to say it this way because I don't agree with a freedom to choose, although I have to agree with the fact that it's a freedom. And while it's a gray area between, murder and thou shalt not kill in the Bible, I step quickly away from that to get to this point. If we'd stop letting ourselves be divided up on the narratives, in this case, you're either pro-life or you're pro-choice, and you come together on freedom, we can save lives and protect lives and promote life by simply saying, I don't agree with your freedom, but what about adoption? Or I don't agree with your freedom, but how do we help people make better choices? And it shouldn't be put on women. How do we help our society in a way that we have less unwanted pregnancies? Or how do we help our society in a way that we have less people having to make the decision between life or, pro-life or pro-choice? And it's not that I'm trying to ignore it, but I think we've all focused our efforts on the freedoms that we can agree on and things that we can agree on. We protect life. Now, with that being said, it goes to you. I don't agree with the COVID vaccine. I don't think that it's a good thing. I've heard way too many bad things about the COVID shot and the COVID vaccine. So I can say I don't agree with that, but I agree with somebody's choice to be able to get that freedom. So I'm going to fight for your freedom to be able to get the vaccine, but I also want to have the freedom, as you said earlier, Christopher, I also want to have the freedom to be able to inform people, which is what got shut down in our legislature, have the right to inform people about their freedom. Is that accurate?
That is very much the case. That is very much the case. And it was unbelievable to me, William, in the legislature that there was a bill right along the lines of what you're saying by a good representative, Amity, who put forward a bill which basically said people have a core constitutional right to exempt out of the vaccine, and they have the right to know and be informed of that exemption. And, in the background with all the coercion, I mean, William, there was a period of time in this state during all the COVID when you would have never known that you had a right to exempt out of that vaccine. Right. Every public agency in the state and in the country were pressuring people to get that vaccine.
Right.
And we had a bill in the legislature that simply said that any time any information goes out from the LDH regarding immunization requirements or vaccines, right alongside it has to be the law written there that talks about people's core right to exempt from the vaccine. That bill was killed by Republicans in our legislature. I don't think people like that deserve to be reelected in the state of Louisiana, William. I really don't. Not when you're talking about something that serious.
Right, because now we're hearing more and more, their studies are out, the vaccine never protected anybody. We're hearing more about all the vaccine injuries. And I don't know about you. I do know about you. I don't have to say it that way. Like, I want to be able to make my own choice for my own body. I mean, and that's what mandates do. They take away your right to make a decision about your own body. Is that?
Oh, that's it. That's it, William. And it is just so important. You and I, one of the things that I've admired about you during the course of time that I've known you, discussions that we've had, is all of our discussions typically come back to the dignity and the sovereignty of the individual, the dignity
Right.
of the individual and the sovereignty of God. And those are the two. If you had to really boil down the foundational concepts of this country, it is the sovereignty of the individual and the dignity of the individual and the sovereignty of God. Our country is founded on those two core concepts, and you and I always come back to that in our discussions.
I love it. I love it. That's why we're kindred spirits. If that's the right way to say it.
Absolutely.
Well, there's a real quick on the Senate side. I'm looking at my little list here. The ones who stood up for freedom that wanted a veto session, and correct me if I'm wrong, looks like Senator Kathy and Cloud did not, or they did. Did they? Let's see. I'm trying to think which ones did not.
They stood with us. They stood with us.
Yeah, they stood with us, right? Stein and Talbot stood with us.
Yes, they did.
Robert Mills, Milligan, McMath, they stood with us that they wanted a veto session. Lambert wanted a veto session. Hewitt, Hensgens, and Henry and Fazee all wanted. They all wanted, along with Cloud and Kathy, they all wanted a veto session.
Yep, Eddie Lambert also.
Yeah, exactly right. Yep, he's right there too. Yep. So
Eddie Lambert also.
Those are all people that we can positively support. That I think did the right thing to want to have a veto session.
Well, William, they did the right thing insofar as the veto session, but there are a number of things, quite frankly, and we got to be straight, that these very same representatives did that were not very good, and that some of these things are included in our 15-bill legislative summary. Some very, very important bills were chopped up and killed by some of the very same legislators who voted for the veto override. And that's why we have to remember, not everything is black and white.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not all black and white. But it is important that the voters understand that if you're going to be a constitutional conservative, you have to be consistent in your principles. You've got to be consistent about what you're doing. And so, look, I applaud these senators for voting for the veto override session. I'm so glad they did. But it is we also have to understand that they did some things that are not good, and we'll talk about that on another show.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Did you want to talk about in the final minute? Did you want to mention some of the Republicans who voted against the veto session?
Well, not now, because what I want to talk about first, because you brought up something that's really a spectacular thought that I think we need to talk about, which is a great point that you made. That when you talk about how many of the ones that didn't do the right thing during session, but then they tried to almost like a final call to do the right thing, by trying to have the veto session. Some of those people, if you watch during session, they're all over the place. Sometimes they're voting against the bill that we think should be voted for, and vice versa. And then sometimes you'll see the maneuvers of these bills that are going through the legislature where people aren't voting to do the right thing for the people. They're voting to maneuver the legislation in such a way that it's either going to come out or not come out in the favor of the right group or individual.
That's right. That's right, William. And a lot of the things that these
10 seconds.
Republicans. Yeah. Okay. Listen, you got to let Jen tell you. This is my 9-year-old son. He wanted to tell you something.
Okay.
Sir William.
So I would give you a hug right here, right now, to the phone, but sadly that's not possible. So I just wanted to say,
Jefferson Parish called Signet Landing, and it is a true gem for Louisiana-style dining for lunch or dinner. And their back porch overlooks a bayou with the boats of fishermen and shrimpers, so their seafood is fresh. So imagine having a meal at Signet Landing, and you won't be disappointed while the sun sets behind the boating community there at Signet Landing, and tell them William Wallis sent you.